All right, good. I would have had some very unhappy people with me if I didn't do that. All right, especially since I left you on a cliffhanger last week. Okay, so last week we kind of left on the idea that uh, some have said that the underlying text for the Old Testament for contemporary English translations and the King James or Reformation era translations are very different. And then there was an introduction that it's even done by Nazis. And so this was all done to try to um, discredit or to what's the word I'm looking for? To make the text that we're dealing with feel unreliable. All right, so that you wouldn't want to use it. All right, and so we're going to build back up to that video, and we're going to deal with how different are these texts. So we'll talk about that. So last week we started in the section of, well, we went through organization, right? We talked about that. We started with organization. How do the verses get divided up? How the chapters get divided up? How are the words going to get divided up since there were no spaces between the words? And yeah, how the book's going to get divided up, such as like First, Second Samuel and things of that nature. Then we dealt with pronunciation, where Ben Asher put in the vowel points to give us the Tiberian dialect. It's not a dialect that's used today. The modern Jewish dialect is different, but the Tiberian dialect is what Ben Asher put in, and we know exactly what Tiberian sounded like because of the way he did his vowel points. Also introduced the idea that there are other vowel pointing systems that were introduced during these times, but it's Ben Asher's that sticks. His is the one that becomes the standard. There were other ones. And so we know other Jewish dialects or Hebrew dialects because of these other types of vowel pointings as well. And then cantillation, this one, I said I didn't know what I was talking about, so I wasn't going to teach it. This is just how they updated how you would sing or I should say how they standardized how you would sing the Old Testament. I didn't spend much time here because it's just there was a lot of musically technical terms, and I'm not musically aligned. So I didn't feel like learning all of the musical terms in order to teach it to you, and probably teach it to you poorly since it would have been my first time ever doing anything of that nature. So I just know that they did it, and I know that it helped them also with organization. That's as much information as I'm going to give you there. And then the last one we went to was scribal correction. And this is kind of my bread and butter. This is where I spend most of my time. And so I wanted to deal with this because this is kind of where we're heading. We're dealing with how we ended up with the Bibles in our lap. And unfortunately, we don't do a lot of singing of the Old Testament. But the singing we do with our Old Testament is usually set to modern hymn style type music, and that's fine. That's not how the Hebrews would have sung it, so that part's not so much affecting us. But the scribal corrections do affect us because you're going to see those show up in your Bibles, okay, as different Bibles handle these scribal corrections differently. All right, and so one of them was, and we're going to talk about this, one of them was the most common scribal correction is what to do with the divine name. We've got three options for how scribes would handle the divine name. We've got Elohim, Yahweh, and we've got Adonai. Elohim, Yahweh, and Adonai. Elohim is the word for God. Adonai is the word for Lord, and Yahweh is also the word for Yahweh, but we also use the word Lord for that one, but we use it in all caps. And so since we had all sorts of different manuscripts that handled these divine names differently, what we found is that Ben Asher, generally speaking, more often than not, when he found Yahweh in the text, he went with Yahweh. Even if there were other manuscripts that said Adonai or Elohim. Okay. Again, Adonai, Lord, Elohim, God. Okay. Elohim, God. But then there were other scribal corrections that he was making that he, for whatever reason, did not feel like he could correct the consonantal text in the text itself, and so he would footnote it. And let's see if you guys remember what these are. So I said there were two readings. It's the Ketib reading and the Kir reading. Does anybody remember what the Ketib reading is? Dan.
Ketib reading.
Yes. Correct. That's awesome. Thank you. The Ketib reading is what is written. It's what's in the text. And the Kir reading is what is read. So as the rabbi or whoever's doing the teaching is reading the text, he would get to a footnote that would direct him to the bottom of the text, and he would read aloud. He would say the footnote. So he would correct the consonantal text by picking the footnote over what's in the text. So the Kir reading is in the footnote, and the Ketib reading is what's in the text. All right. And then I just started demonstrating some of those to you. In Isaiah 9:3, we have two readings. We have on the NKJV side there, you have multiplied the nation and increased its joy. But in the KJV, you have thou hast multiplied the nation and not increased the joy. We get a polar opposite reading there, depending on if we go with the Ketib reading or the Kir reading. And this is done by showing you the footnotes. Most footnotes are going to address this for you. And I realize that's small font for you, but the says Masoretic text says not increase. Okay, and remember, I had an issue with that because the Kir reading is part of the Masoretic text. All right, the Kir reading is a part of the Masoretic text just as much as the Ketib reading is. So when a footnote like this says the Masoretic text says something different, but it's still in the Masoretic text, I don't feel like that's enough information. Okay, it's almost leading you astray. And so I don't care for that one. This one, the NASB 20 says another reading is not increased, which is true. It is another reading. It's not very helpful to tell you, like if you wanted to go search where that reading came from, they're not really telling you. And CSB says alternate Hebrew tradition has not increased joy. If you're using a CSB, when you see alternate Hebrew tradition, that's what they're referring to. There's a Kir reading and a Ketib reading, and we're picking the other one. Whatever's in our text, there's another one that's not in our text. That's the alternate Hebrew tradition. So they're not necessarily telling you which one's which, but they're telling you that there's two. Okay, and we've picked one, and there's another. The KJV itself, if you have a KJV with footnotes, they also let you know that there's another reading that reads differently. They don't tell you where it comes from. That's okay. But it's just, they just give you the straight, hey, there's another reading. And so they are footnoting, in this case, the Kir reading, and they're putting in the text the Ketib reading. Okay. And then we've got another one. Oh, the NKJV, my favorite for this particular subject. The NKJV just kills it when I'm handling with Ketib and Kir readings because they're the most explicit. They write, following the Kir and Targum, Ketib and Vulgate have not increased, and then Septuagint has essentially a reading that's similar to the Kir reading. And so I really enjoy when I'm dealing with this particular issue, the one we're talking about right now, the NKJV is the only printed Bible that I'm aware of that deals with these textual variants by name. I have other digital Bibles that do deal with this by name, like the Lexham English Bible. They don't print that. It's only digital. So, but this is very helpful that in a printed Bible, they tell you that there's a alternate reading. Then I just wanted to show another example. This one's a little bit different because some italics Bibles, okay, and I think I've made an assumption that everybody knows what italics are for in a Bible that uses italics. So I shouldn't make that assumption. Some people may not know. And I say that because I had a woman in our church, woman in our home not too long ago who was from a previous church. And when I asked her the question, do you know what the italics are in your KJV? She said, they're there for emphasis, which is true for modern writing. When we use italics in modern writing, we're generally emphasizing something, but that's not true for the KJV. The KJV is letting you know that there isn't an underlying source language text for this word, that they supplied the text because it doesn't work in English without the supply. We have to add it to make the English work. I'm going to deal with the problems with italics in a different lesson. But overall, that's the point of italics. If you have a Bible that utilizes italics, they're saying to you, we added information here for your benefit, but we're also telling you that we added it by putting it in italics. Okay. Generally speaking, that's how it's done. Sometimes it's also done, and this is why it gets confusing, to demonstrate that there's a textual variant. We have a different reading in another manuscript, and we're going with that reading in the text, and we're supplying it in italics. And so that's what happens here. The KJV and the NKJV here put this word no in italics, even though this word no or nay is a Keir reading. It's a Keir reading. It's not that there isn't an underlying supplied text and we're adding it for your clarity. We're choosing an alternate reading here, and we're letting you know by italics, and I don't think it's very helpful in this case. But you'll see other translations that use italics don't put it in italics. The NASB and the LSB here, they don't put it in italics because it's not a supplied reading. It is part of the Keir reading. And so I think that's the right direction to go. You have underlying Hebrew support, so you don't need the italics. I hope that makes sense. If anybody is confused about the purpose of italics, especially when I point something out like this, feel free to talk to me after. I'll try to break it down even more simply or in a different way to help you understand. But that's essentially that. Also, interestingly enough, that the original 1611 KJV did not put the word in italics, and I think they handled that correctly, as opposed to the current update that is in italics. And I say italics here, it's only because they didn't utilize italics in 1611. They had this cool Gothic font, and when they would supply words, they would put it in the plain Roman font. Boring. But the plain Roman font is what then substitutes what would become our italics later. And they did not put the word nay in the Roman font or in italics. A later editor changed that. And I think the later editor, in my opinion, shouldn't have done that. They should have left it in the standard font. All right, because it is a Keir reading. Okay. All right. So that's that. Okay. I did mention last week, if this is an interesting one to you, maybe you want to write this down. 2 Kings 19:31 has some Bible translations have Lord of Hosts in that Bible. 2 Kings 19:31, Lord of Hosts. You'll see some have it in italics, some don't have it at all. Some and it's the of hosts part. All of them have the Lord. Some have of hosts in italics. Some don't have the italics at all and don't even have the phrase of hosts there. And some do, and some don't have it in italics. So you see all sorts of different ways that one's handled. But the of hosts part, Lord of hosts, that's a Keir reading. And so different translations are unsure, or I should say different translators are unsure as to which reading they should follow. Should they follow the Lord of hosts Keir reading, or should they just drop it and stick with the Ketib reading that just says Lord in that verse? All right. And so this is where we also began to introduce the family of Masoretic text editions. And this is where I'm going to spend a little bit of extra time. So we had the Proto-Masoretic texts. We talked about this last week. The Proto-Masoretic texts are generally fragments. We don't have whole Bibles. Generally fragments of the Hebrew text in which the consonants line up with the Masoretic text consonants. Because remember, the vowels aren't added until the Masoretic text. So we have what we call Proto-Masoretic text before the Masoretic text, essentially the text that they would have been adding vowel points to. So we have those. Those are fragments. They make up. And then we have Codex Aleppo. This one's important to keep in your mind. Codex Aleppo is the text Ben Asher did. We have it. Still exists today. Okay, what Ben Asher did still exists. Then a couple of decades later, there was a copy of it called the Leningrad Codex. The Leningrad Codex. These are just basically the names of them, of the codexes, are just where the manuscripts were found. Okay, or where they were kept, not always found. It's not like they were lost to us, where they were kept. Okay, so the Leningrad Codex is a copy of the Aleppo Codex. It's almost identical. In some places, you could put the Leningrad Codex on top of the Aleppo Codex, and it would look like they traced it. Okay, it's right down to every line and space on the page. It's identical. But it is not identical in every spot. There are some paragraph marks that are different. So they broke the paragraph in a different spot. There are some vowel pointings that are different. But overall, by and large, the Codex Leningrad is identical to the Codex Aleppo. Okay, they're nearly identical. All right, then we have rabbinic Bibles. And these are rabbis who are doing the same thing. They're copying the previous codexes that I'm talking about, but they're adding commentary. They become a sort of Jewish study Bible for rabbis. All right, and the second one that was done is called the Joseph Ben Chaim Bible. That particular Bible came out at a good time because the printing press had just really started being utilized for the Bible. And so it was the first rabbinic Bible to be printed on the printing press. And it is the printed version of the Joseph Ben Chaim Bible is called the Daniel Bomberg Bible. So it's the same Bible as the Joseph Ben Chaim, but it's a printed version. That printed version of the Bomberg Bible, the Bomberg Bible is the printed version of the Joseph Ben Chaim Bible, is what all the Reformation era Bibles use to translate their Bibles. Okay, so Tyndale doing the Torah and a few other books. Tyndale, Matthew's Bible, Geneva Bible, KJV, all of those. Those are all using the Bomberg Bible to do their translation in the Old Testament. Now, the Bomberg Bible and the Joseph Ben Chaim Bible is not identical to the previous Bibles. There are 9 places where there are differences for the whole Old Testament. 9 places. I'm going to show you those 9 places. All right? It's because there's only 9, so we can go through. All right. In the Joseph Ben Chaim Bomberg textual variants, if you go to 1 Kings 20:38, the Codex Leningrad, Codex Aleppo, they're going to say that he disguised himself with a bandage over his eyes. But the Joseph Ben Chaim Bomberg Bible is going to say he disguised himself with ashes on his face. Okay, this is the difference of a letter or two that causes you to read ashes or bandage. Okay, and so that's the difference. That's a textual variant in which most translations today go with the Leningrad, not the Bomberg, because this is the first time the textual variant is introduced. We don't find it until the Bomberg Bible. Okay. The next variant is in Proverbs 8:16, but I'm going to read 8:15 because this is actually kind of important to this variant. All right. In 8:15, it says, "It is by me that kings reign and rulers enact just law." So this is the CSB I'm reading from. And then verse 16, it says, "By me princes lead and do nobles and all righteous judges." Okay, we'll come back to the verse in a second. Then you read it in the KJV. "By me kings reign and princes decree justice. By me princes rule and nobles, even all the judges of the earth." So the textual variant here is whether you have earthly judges or righteous judges. Okay. And again, we're just talking about a letter or two that changes the reading. All right. So earthly judges or righteous judges. Almost everyone today says the righteous judges reading is the correct one for 2 reasons. One, it comes from the earlier text. The first time this text is introduced is through the Bomberg Bible, but also there's a set of parallelism that's happening here that helps affirm the reading of righteous judges. So if we go back to verse 15, you see, "It is by me that kings reign and rulers enact just laws. And by me, princes lead, as do nobles and all righteous judges." So the righteous judges and just laws are that parallelism there. So we see a Hebrew parallelism that's happening here that you don't get when you read it out of the Bomberg Bible, which says they decree justice or judges of the earth. You don't get that same parallelism. Okay, so that's It's internal evidence for the particular reading as opposed to just strictly external evidence. All right, next one. This is one of the ones. Remember, we started this lesson with what do you do with the divine name? Is it Adonai, Elohim, or Yahweh? Those are your options for this. Well, we have two manuscripts. The Bomberg Bible here in Isaiah 10:16, you see the word Lord there in the KJV side is in all lowercase, and the word Lord on the Webster's English Bible, I chose that one just because it was easier to see in this one. The Webster's English Bible is all caps. When it's in all caps, what it's saying is the underlying text here is Yahweh. When it's in lowercase and it's the word Lord like this, then the underlying text is Adonai. Okay. And so here, Codex Leningrad and Codex Aleppo and the Dead Sea Scrolls, I believe, is this the one? Yes, and the Dead Sea Scrolls all have Yahweh here. Okay. And the Bomberg text and the Joseph ben Chaim text has the word Adonai here. So this is a place where a variant went the other way. Generally speaking, Ben Asher would have chosen Yahweh for this type of reading, and he did. I say generally speaking, in this case, he did. And for whatever reason, we're not sure what happened, but the Joseph ben Chaim and the Bomberg text says Adonai here instead. So it's a textual variant, same word in English, but it's a textual variant in Hebrew. Okay. The next one is Isaiah 27:2. It says, on that day, sing about a desirable vineyard, or in that day, sing unto her a vineyard of red wine. So the question is it a desirable vineyard or is it a vineyard of red wine? And again, the earlier Aleppo text and actually, I got to be careful. Is the Aleppo text? I don't remember if the Aleppo text, I'm going to talk about the Aleppo text more in a minute. But the Codex Leningrad says desirable vineyard, where the Joseph ben Chaim text says vineyard of red wine. Okay. In either case, I think this ends up being the same sense. A desirable vineyard is a vineyard of red wine. So I think you end up in the same reading. This is another one where we have the opposite situation. The earlier texts use the word Adonai here, and the Joseph ben Chaim uses the divine name here. Okay. So this is just, again, another situation where what do we do with the divine name? And actually, I want to go back to this one. This particular one is also interesting along the same notes. Which reading is it, the Joseph ben Chaim or the Leningrad text? Because this one is Lord of Hosts. So here we have another Lord of Hosts situation. Every single time Lord of Hosts shows up in the Hebrew Testament, it's always Yahweh of Hosts, always, except this place. For whatever reason, in the Joseph ben Chaim Bible, they have one reading in which it's Adonai of Hosts, which never occurs anywhere else. This would be a unique reading because the title is always the same throughout the Old Testament. So this would be a unique reading. So this one's different. This one's not a Lord of Hosts issue. This is just, do we use Adonai or Yahweh? The older texts, the Aleppo and Leningrad texts say Adonai. Joseph ben Chaim uses Yahweh. The next one is super interesting. You're going to see I don't have any underlines for this one. No underlines for this one. So I'm not the one finding these textual variants. I'm reading people who have discovered them, and there are multiple lists out there. And two of the three lists that deal with these textual variants include this verse, Jeremiah 34:1. But as I worked through it, and every manuscript I looked at, so the problem with these lists is they just list them. They're like, here are the references in which there are textual variants between these two texts. And they don't tell me what the textual variant is. They don't explain it. So I have to go open these manuscripts. I have to go read the Hebrew. I have to find the variant, and I have to find the corresponding English word so I can present it to you, which is fun. I love doing it. But in this case, because there's nobody explaining it to me, and I'm reading the Hebrew in every manuscript I can find, and I'm working through it, I can't find a textual variant between Joseph ben Chaim or the Bomberg text. it's also missing in one of the three lists I look at. This verse isn't referenced. So I don't know if this is a mistake on some people's parts. In the research I was doing, the one thing that did keep popping up is that Nebuchadnezzar here is spelled differently in the Masoretic text. It's actually spelled Nebuchadrezzar with an R instead of an N. But that itself is the same in all of the Masoretic texts. They all spell it Nebuchadrezzar. And so I couldn't find a textual variant between the Joseph ben Chaim and the Codex Leningrad text. I don't know what's going on here. So if someone out there in internet world is listening to this and they can inform me, I would love to hear it, but I think this one might be a mistake. I don't think this one necessarily belongs on the list. This one's actually really cool because the KJV actually handles this textual variant. And I found it interesting to see how this variant was handled throughout different translations through history. It says, I'm not going to try to pronounce that word, but also the day shall be, and if you can kind of read behind the footnote there, it says darkened, okay? The day shall be darkened, and then the footnote in front of it says, or restrained. The day shall be restrained. These are differences between Codex Leningrad and Joseph ben Chaim. All right, and the KJV translators are actually footnoting this here, letting you know that there are two readings here. Ultimately, they read the exact same way. In fact, the Geneva Bible chooses the footnote in the KJV as what should be in the text, and they render it this way. And I thought it was really good to just hear how you might say it. They write, as the day will restrain its light, as the day will restrain its light. So the day will restrain its light, or the day will be darkened, is the same reading, but they are two different Hebrew words. And the footnote in the KJV lets you know that there's a textual variant there. Although when you're done reading it, you can't come to a different conclusion. It's going to be dark. All right. The next one is from Zephaniah 3:15. It says, you need no longer fear harm in the CSB, or thou shalt not see evil anymore. So evil and harm here are synonymous. It's not evil in the sense of sin. It is evil in the sense of damage, harm. Okay, but the word, the textual variant here is whether or not you will see it or whether or not you will fear it. Obviously, if you don't see it, you won't fear it. But that doesn't mean if you don't fear it, you don't necessarily see it. So there's a little bit of play here. But that is one where the Joseph ben Chaim Bible adds the word see here. That wasn't there in Codex Leningrad. And then the last one is the same sort of situation. What do we do with the divine name in Malachi? Is it the Lord's table, Adonai's table, or is it Yahweh's table? Okay, and so you can see the variation there. The Bomberg Bible chooses Yahweh, and all of the other translations choose Adonai, or I should say all the translations that follow the Codex Leningrad here follow Adonai. Okay, that was the last one. So we've got, here we go. We've got the Joseph ben Chaim Bible and the Bomberg Bible being nearly identical with the Codex Leningrad and Aleppo, with the exception of those 9 places or 8 places if you count that Jeremiah one. So I'll say 8 places because I can confirm those 8. So aside from those 8 places, those Bibles are completely identical. You now know the differences between the entire Old Testament, between these texts on those 8 Bibles that are actually significant enough to impact our translation. Okay, some of them are vowel pointings that don't impact our translation. Okay, and then Biblia Hebraica, 1906. This is a printed, redone version of the Joseph ben Chaim Bible. And this is done by a man by the name of Rudolph Kittel. Rudolph Kittel, you might recognize his name from the video last week. Okay, so Rudolph Kittel is the man who does this Bible. And he is doing an exact replica of the Joseph ben Chaim Bible in 1906. Okay, he's doing. Is it perfect? No. Is it nearly identical in every place? Yes. Okay, it's not worth even talking about the minor differences because you'll never see them because they don't show up in translation because they can't show up in translation. Okay, they're just not translatable differences. And then, so that's his first edition, is the 1906 version. He does a second edition in 1912, okay, in which he redoes his work. He finds the errors he made, he corrects them, and this time he adds textual footnotes where there are variants. He did not have marginal footnotes initially in 1906. He just did the text. Marginal footnotes are super important. You're going to hear me harp on marginal footnotes forever because they're super important. 1906, he didn't include footnotes. 1912, he did. Okay. Then he learned about the Codex Leningrad. Okay. He learned about the Codex Leningrad, remember, which is identical to the Joseph ben Chaim, with the exception of those 8 places. And he begins to do a third revision of his work, and he dies before he completes it. Okay. That third revision is completed by 2 other men, Otto Eisfelt and Albrecht Alt. Otto Eisfelt and Albrecht Alt. Okay. Those 2 men finish his work. They finish his work in 1937. 1937. He's already dead at this point. That becomes the first edition of number 8 on the list, Biblia Hebraica Starkartensia. Okay. That's the first edition of that one. That work is the work where they did a diplomatic work of the Leningrad Codex instead of the Joseph ben Chaim. So this is the first time the Leningrad Codex is used. Now, why is it that the Leningrad Codex is being used and not the Aleppo Codex, which we have, which is older? That became the question I asked. In 1947, there was a riot in Aleppo that attacked I believe it was a synagogue, in which Codex Aleppo existed. And this is like super controversial. If you're into conspiracy theories, this might be something fun for you to investigate, because there's all sorts of conspiracy theories as to what happened to Codex Aleppo here. Some say it was damaged by a fire. Some say that someone went in and took a portion of Codex Aleppo. There's controversy about whether there's any fire damage on the rest of the Bible, so on and so forth. We have actually found some pages that belong to Codex Aleppo since then that just showed up. But essentially speaking, Codex Aleppo today is missing 40% of the Old Testament. And so it's a lot. It's missing quite a bit. And so Codex Leningrad is used as the substitute. So most places use Codex Aleppo where we have it. And where we don't have it, the other 60%, or where we don't have it, the other 40%, the 40% that's missing, we use Codex Leningrad to fill in the gaps. So that's how we do that. And so most translations today are diplomatic work of Codex Leningrad. And remember, the only difference between Joseph ben Chaim and Codex Leningrad are those 8 variants, okay? And so this is why most of the arguments that we hear talked about today have to do with the New Testament, not the Old Testament. And yet somehow we're still hearing information about the Old Testament as if, depending on the circles you're in, the circles I was in, where the KJV is presented as being a completely different Old Testament than your modern translations, despite the information I just showed you and walked you through. And so we'll go back to, this is Dan Hafley. He is a member of the King James Bible Research Council, and it is his job, his living essentially, to defend the King James and KJV onlyism from this perspective. And so here he's answering a question from a viewer that the viewer raised about the underlying text of the Old Testament in modern translations. He particularly talks about the ESV here, but it's all of the translations, all of them. The NKJV, all of them use Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, okay? And they all use them because there's 9 differences, all right? And so he's going to talk about why he doesn't trust Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia.
The ESV is based on the Masoretic text of the Hebrew Bible, as found in Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia was produced by Rudolf Kittel. He and his son Gerard were involved in producing Hebrew lexicons and actually had influence over Hitler and his pogroms. In fact, Rudolf's son was arrested and imprisoned at the end of World War II for Nazi war crimes against Jews. That bothers me a bit because Paul says in Romans 3, what advantage hath the Jew? Much every way, for chiefly to them was committed the oracles of God. So if God said, I'm going to commit the oracles to the Jews, and then we have a Bible based on a text produced by a guy who hated Jews so much that he assisted in the attempted extermination of the Jews, I don't think God was anywhere near his work.
All right. So let's talk about some of his...
The ESV is based on the Masoretic.
There we go. Sometimes when I click the next slide, it wants to replay it. All right. Let's talk about some of his issues here. One, the 1977 version that all of our translations are based off of are not done by Rudolf Kittel, first of all. It's his 1937 edition that he never finished. That was done by Rudolf Kittel, and it was finished by two other men, okay? Secondly, he brings in his son, Gerard Kittel. Gerard Kittel and Rudolf Kittel, let me give you some background about who they are. They are Lutherans. And if you know, we've talked about this, pastors talked about this in church history. Luther, at the end of his life, became quite anti-Semitic. And we do believe that some of Luther's influence in Germany and his anti-Semitism did lead to some anti-Semitism that could have influenced Nazism and Hitler. I don't deny that. However, Gerard he's a part of writing the lexicons, which is true. He's part of writing lexicons that he finished before World War II ever started. He was not, we have no evidence whatsoever that Gerard Kittel had any input on the work that his father did. His father and him didn't work on Biblia Hebraica together. As far as we're aware, we have no evidence that they did. They both worked on lexicons, but they have two sets of lexicons. Rudolph's lexicon is not the same as Gerard's lexicon. Secondly, when Rudolph finished his first edition, that would have made Gerard 17 years old at the time. Again, we don't have necessarily any connection that he was a part of it. And thirdly, we'll talk about the genetic fallacy. The genetic fallacy here is where we argue against a particular work because of where it came from, or a particular claim because of where it came from, instead of the merits of the claim or the work. So in other words, if we were to take his same argument and we were just to apply it, if Hitler himself wrote word for word our New Testament or our Old Testament, we ought to reject it. Because Hitler drank water, we probably shouldn't drink water. Like, this is where we say we can't make these arguments about where it came from. Thirdly, he says that the Jews were given the oracles of God. We've been using that argument all along to establish the Old Testament canon, right? And so I think it's not a bad argument to establish the Old Testament text as well. The problem is he's acting like Codex Leningrad wasn't done by Jews. Remember, Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia is a diplomatic work of Codex Leningrad, done by Jews, a few decades after Codex Aleppo was done. So the Jews received that. Now, and if you go talk to Jewish people today, because I have some Jewish friends on Facebook, and I ask them, what is your Hebrew Old Testament? What do you read? They say the Masoretic text. I said, which one? Which family? Codex Aleppo is the authoritative text. Where we don't have it, we use Codex Leningrad. Okay, well then we're in lockstep with Jews here. They're using the same text we're using. And I don't even necessarily think we have to follow the Jews in every place. And we don't, because there are multiple places where we follow the Septuagint or the Latin Vulgate. In fact, there's no translation today, including the King James, that does not use the Septuagint, the Latin Vulgate, the Peshitta, and various texts of the Masoretic text to incorporate into their translation. They're all doing it. What we're doing today is no different than what the KJV translators did. they have footnotes and they choose readings that are outside the Ben Chaim text that are in Codex Leningrad as well. So I get frustrated a little bit when I hear stuff like this because it's intended to undermine your trust in the Bible that's in your lap. And I think it's wrong. It's wrong for them to go that route. There's another guy, D.A. Waite. He writes a book, The KJV Defended. And in his book on page 23, he suggests that there are 20,000 to 30,000 suggested updates in Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia over the Joseph Ben Chaim Bible. This is a misrepresentation of the information. There are many footnotes in the 1977 version. Basically, what this is the text itself is Codex Leningrad. But in the footnotes, they write in all of the textual variants from the Septuagint, the Vulgate. It's a one-stop shop. If you want to know what all the readings are, you go to this one because they put it all there. And so I'll give you this one here. Joshua 21, 36 through 37. You all have these verses in your Bibles. They are not found in any of the Masoretic text Bibles. None of them. And so I'll teach you a quick word here, and then I'll finish this up here. You see the word at the top there, homeoteliuton. Homeoteliuton is a word, it's a Greek word, homeo meaning same, and teleuton meaning end. And when we have one verse that ends a particular way and another verse that ends an identical way, even the best scribes get tripped up. Have you ever copied anything down? And when you're copying it, your eye skips to the wrong line and you begin to copy and you miss something. In fact, the other day I was writing the Apostles' Creed by hand. I was writing it down. And the Apostles' Creed starts with I believe or we believe in multiple places. I believe, I believe, I believe. Well, one of those times, my eye skipped. I did the opposite. It's called homeoarchton, same beginning. I began to rewrite the same line I already wrote because I'm adding material because my eye skipped to a line I was already on, expecting to be on the next line. Homeoteliuton does the same thing. So if you look at here, Joshua 21:35, it says it ends in 4 cities. And if you look at 21:37, it ends in 4 cities. So what the scribe did is he wrote this verse and his eye skipped to this verse and he wrote this one next. All right. And he left behind 36 and 37. They're not in any of our Masoretic texts. In fact, the NKJV says, hey, we're following the Septuagint and the Vulgate here. Masoretic texts, Bomberg and Targum omit verses 36 and 37. They dropped 2 verses accidentally because their eyes skipped while they were doing the work. This happens all the time. We're going to talk about this more when we get to the New Testament. So if you're a Masoretic text onlyist or a KJV onlyist, you have to deal with this information. Either the Masoretic text has an error here, or all of our translations have an error here. And in my opinion, the Masoretic text has an error here. There are other Hebrew texts that contain this, but none of them are on the Masoretic text line. They're in fragments that we have. This is a common situation that we have identified and we know they messed it here. And 1 Chronicles 6, 78 and 79 has the same information, the same text, and it has these verses, essentially these lists that are included here. So we know it's there. So this is called homeoteliuton. This is just to demonstrate that the Masoretic text is extremely reliable, extremely reliable. It does a fantastic job of maintaining the Old Testament, but it is not perfect. It's not perfect. It still requires work. And every scribe has worked through and tried to attempt to fix these works. What I didn't show you here is Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia has these verses here, okay? But you see them in small font. That small font is letting you know that they actually don't exist in the Masoretic text. And then they have all the footnotes here to tell you where you can find those verses, what manuscripts you would use to actually get those verses. So that's that. That's the end of the Masoretic text. It's super reliable. I thank God for his preservation. He's put us in this position. He's left us not with a God's eye view of the text, but a text in which we have to be humble and do some work. And I thank him for that. I think Bill said it to me last week that the truth, God rewards those who seek the truth. And I agree with that. And I praise the Lord for that. Next week, we're done with the Masoretic text. We're going to move on to John Wycliffe the morning star of the Reformation. You all are dismissed.